There comes a moment when silence becomes a form of surrender, when holding back truth is not humility but fear dressed in disguise. God never called us to live as shadows in a world of voices. He called us to speak life into places where death has long been accepted as natural. When God said, "Let there be light," the universe did not argue, it simply obeyed. The same divine spark that spoke galaxies into motion dwells in the heart of every soul that dares to believe. That same command still echoes today. Open your mouth, for creation is waiting for your sound. The human tongue was not given merely for taste or talk, but for testimony. Too often we imprison our words behind the bars of hesitation. We convince ourselves that someone wiser, stronger, or holier should speak instead. Yet heaven has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the mighty. God is not waiting for your perfection. He is waiting for your permission. He wants your willingness more than your eloquence. Your voice, trembling though it may be, can break chains that silence cannot. When the heart is full of divine truth, keeping quiet becomes impossible. The fire within refuses to be contained. Think of the prophets who trembled before kings but spoke anyway, not because they were fearless, but because they were aflame. The moment you dare to open your mouth in faith, God turns your whisper into thunder. What seems like ordinary speech becomes the echo of eternity. Words born from obedience carry a strength no earthly authority can silence. There are countless souls who walk in darkness, not because God has hidden himself, but because his people have hidden their voices. If you have seen light, you owe the world your witness. If you have known grace, you owe the world your gratitude in sound. Your story, no matter how broken, is sacred ground, because it reveals what God can do with dust and breath. Do not underestimate the power of one honest word spoken in faith. It can ignite revival in the barren heart of another. To open your mouth is not arrogance, it is alignment. It is saying, "God, speak through me even if my voice shakes." It is understanding that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is disobedience disguised as calm. There is a time to listen, but there is also a time to declare. You were not designed to live muted in a world starving for truth. You were designed to let heaven's language flow through human lips, to bring eternity close enough for others to hear. The enemy fears your voice because it carries authority, not your own, but the authority of the one who sent you. Every lie loses its footing when truth is spoken. Every shadow flees when light is declared. When you remain silent, you allow fear to finish a sentence that God began. When you open your mouth, you allow the word to complete its purpose. The tongue, once yielded to the divine, becomes a sword sharper than reason, softer than mercy, and stronger than despair. Some wait for a perfect moment, but obedience never waits for comfort. God rarely calls you to speak when it's easy. He calls you when the world most needs courage. He will fill your mouth if you will open it. He will anoint your speech if you dare to move your lips. Heaven has always advanced through those who refuse to keep quiet when silence felt safe. So open your mouth when injustice crushes the weak. Open your mouth when truth trembles on the edge of extinction. Open your mouth when your own heart needs to hear again what faith sounds like. Speak hope into your own valley. Speak life over what looks dead. Every word you offer in faith becomes a seed planted in eternity. God does not need perfection. He desires participation. He calls your voice because it bears his breath. You may think your words are too small, too broken, too late. But remember, even the smallest flame can defeat a room full of darkness. Speak, not because you are ready, but because you are chosen. Open your mouth and let the word that made worlds move once more through you. Your voice is a vessel through which God's power and truth are released into the world. Your voice is a vessel through which God's power and truth are released into the world. And the moment you begin to understand that, the way you see yourself changes forever. You are not merely speaking into the air when you speak with faith. You are releasing something eternal. God, who created the heavens and the earth through words, has placed that same creative essence within you. It is through the spoken word that life begins, light breaks through darkness, and the invisible becomes visible. When you speak in alignment with truth, you participate in that divine act of creation. Your voice becomes the echo of God's will moving through time, shaping reality, healing wounds, and awakening souls that have been sleeping beneath the weight of silence. To be silent when God calls you to speak is to keep light trapped inside a vessel that was never meant to be sealed. When you open your mouth, something shifts in the unseen realm. The power that God breathed into humanity was not meant to lie dormant. Words are not merely vibrations of sound. They are carriers of intent, instruments of transformation. Your tongue holds the ability to bless, to heal, to restore, to rebuild. Heaven waits for willing lips to utter what God has already spoken in spirit. When faith and voice align, creation responds. The sick are encouraged, the broken find hope, and the lost hear direction. It is not about eloquence or human persuasion. It is about surrendering your speech to the divine breath that first brought life into clay. Every time you speak under His guidance, you become a living conduit of His energy, a vessel that transmits light into places where only shadows have lived. Your voice is not small in God's hands. It is a spark that can ignite revival where despair once reigned. There is something sacred about the human voice when it carries purpose. It is the bridge between heaven and earth, the sound through which God continues His dialogue with creation. When you speak words filled with truth and love, you open portals of grace that extend beyond what the eyes can see. That is why the enemy fights so hard to silence you. He knows that a single voice in agreement with God can dismantle lies that have stood for generations. He knows that a whisper of faith can shake the foundations of hopelessness. You have been given the same breath that animated Adam, the same divine imprint that turned dust into destiny. Every time you speak what is right, you remind the world that God's word still walks among men. Your sound carries His authority when your heart carries His will. It is not by accident that God chose speaking as the method of creation. The universe itself was born through divine speech. Let there be were not just words. They were decrees that tore through the void and birthed existence. That pattern was not a moment in history. It was a model for humanity. We were made in the image of a speaking God, designed to echo His creative nature through faith-filled words. When you use your voice to bless, to uplift, to declare truth, you mirror that same divine process. You join the eternal rhythm of creation, where every word has weight and every sound has consequence. Your voice becomes a continuation of God's original "Let there be," echoing through the corridors of time to awaken what has fallen asleep. The world around you is starving for voices of courage, not merely opinions, but truth spoken with conviction. You may think your words are insignificant, but history is shaped not by the loudest, but by those who dared to speak when silence seemed safer. When you open your mouth with love, heaven moves. When you declare peace where there is chaos, angels take position. When you proclaim hope where there is despair, chains begin to loosen. Your words are not empty. They are carriers of spiritual frequency. The vibration of a righteous word can travel further than you can imagine, reaching hearts you will never meet, stirring destinies you will never witness. That is the mystery of divine communication. You sow sound into the world, and God turns it into transformation. There will be times when fear tells you to stay silent. You will feel unworthy, unprepared, uncertain of what to say. But remember that Moses stuttered, Jeremiah doubted, and yet their voices became instruments of deliverance. God has never required perfect speech. He requires a willing mouth. When you step beyond hesitation, the Spirit fills the gap. The words you feared would falter are strengthened by power beyond your own. The more you speak what is right, the more heaven flows through your tone. Every time you open your mouth for good, you are participating in divine warfare, lacing lies with truth, despair with hope, death with life. That is why your voice is sacred, because it carries the potential to rebuild the world one word at a time. Your voice holds a key to atmospheres. Have you ever noticed how a single word of encouragement can lift someone from the edge of giving up? How a soft prayer spoken aloud can change the course of a day? Words are spirit. They shape emotions. They carve realities. A kind voice can heal where medicine cannot reach. A word of faith can open doors that logic had locked. The power is not in you, but in the one who breathes through you when you choose to speak truth. The vessel may feel fragile, but the treasure within it is indestructible. When you realize that your voice is the channel through which heaven flows, you begin to speak not from fear but from authority, not from pride but from purpose. Every syllable becomes sacred because it carries eternity within it. The greatest tragedy is not the wicked words of the loud, but the sacred silence of the called. Too many hide behind humility when God is waiting for obedience. He has already placed the word in your mouth. All that remains is courage. Your silence cannot comfort a hurting world, but your voice can awaken it. You may not know how powerful you are until you dare to speak. For when you do, you will discover that your mouth was never yours alone. It was designed to be an instrument of divine resonance, carrying light into darkness and life into death. And through it, the unseen power of God continues to move across the earth, shaping hearts and transforming souls through the vessel of your voice. Silence in the face of divine prompting is disobedience disguised as humility. Silence in the face of divine prompting is disobedience disguised as humility, and though it often wears the appearance of reverence, it is in truth a quiet rebellion against purpose. Many convince themselves that holding back words is a form of modesty, that remaining quiet is a sign of peace, but heaven knows the difference between stillness born of wisdom and silence born of fear. There are moments when silence is holy, but there are also moments when silence is harmful, when God places truth upon the heart and the soul refuses to speak it. That truth begins to ache within like a fire contained too long. To ignore the voice of God is not humility. It is hesitation disguised as virtue. It is the soul trying to appear gentle while it hides from its calling. God never asked his people to be voiceless spectators in the story of light. He called them to be vessels of it, carriers of words that reshape reality through obedience. When you feel the nudge within your spirit to speak, and you refuse, you are not preserving peace, you are withholding revelation. You silence not only your own voice, but also the echoes of heaven that were meant to flow through you. There are people waiting on the other side of your obedience, hearts that will never hear what they need to hear if you stay quiet. We often think silence protects us from rejection, from judgment, from the weight of responsibility, but it also protects the enemy's lies from being exposed. Silence gives darkness permission to speak louder. Every time a believer withholds truth, a lie grows stronger in the world. Every time light hides behind caution, shadows deepen in confidence. The illusion of humility is dangerous because it feels righteous, yet it delays divine work. True humility is not silence, it is surrender, and surrender means speaking when God says speak. There is a kind of quiet that looks holy but is rooted in fear of man. Fear that words will offend, that voices will be mocked, that truth will bring trouble. But God never promised that truth would be easy. He promised it would be freeing. The prophets were not applauded when they spoke, yet they obeyed because obedience mattered more than approval. The moment you begin to prefer comfort over calling, you begin to lose your fire. The voice of fear says, "What if I am wrong?" But the voice of faith says, "What if this is God?" and that question alone should move the heart to act. Silence that grows from fear is the enemy of purpose. The one who hides their word when prompted hides their light under a basket and wonders why darkness persists around them. When God speaks into you, He expects to speak through you. The word you swallow out of fear becomes the lesson you will later learn through regret. There is no humility in ignoring the Spirit's urging. The one who created your voice knows its value, knows where it must be heard, and knows whose heart it will reach. If you stay quiet, you interrupt the flow of divine intention. You may think you are being patient or wise, but there is a difference between waiting for God's timing and refusing to act under His command. Silence becomes disobedience when it resists the urgency of His whisper. You do not have to speak with power for God to move through you. You only need to speak with willingness. It is not the loudness of your voice that matters, but the alignment of your heart with His will. Even a trembling whisper becomes thunder in the spiritual realm when it is born of obedience. The miracle is not in the volume, but in the surrender. A quiet yes to God carries more weight than 1,000 eloquent speeches said without faith. Many hide behind the false humility of thinking others are more qualified to speak. They look at their flaws, their past, their insecurities, and decide their silence is a form of respect for those who seem more holy. But God has always chosen unlikely mouths. The fisherman, the shepherd, the tax collector, all were ordinary until they opened their mouths in obedience. God does not choose the flawless. He chooses the faithful. To wait until you are perfect before speaking is to wait forever. Silence becomes a prison where potential decays. Every divine truth withheld by fear loses its immediate power, not because God's word is weak, but because He honors human freedom. If you will not speak it, He will give it to another who will. The choice to remain silent is the choice to surrender your part in the divine conversation. What an honor it is that God desires to speak through dust and breath, and yet how often we decline that invitation in the name of false humility. There are times when silence masquerades as peace, but peace that comes from avoidance is fragile. It crumbles the moment truth is needed. Real peace does not come from withholding your words. It comes from releasing them in love. There are people whose lives depend on hearing what God placed in you to say. A word of kindness, a correction spoken with grace, a testimony whispered in faith. These are seeds that grow into miracles. Silence robs the soil of those seeds. The world needs living words, not bottled faith. The most dangerous thing you can do with truth is hide it. When you speak, you may risk misunderstanding. When you stay silent, you guarantee it. The silence of the faithful allows the noise of falsehood to dominate the earth. What begins as hesitation can end as betrayal of purpose. The enemy celebrates every time a believer decides to keep quiet. When truth burns in their chest, true humility is not found in the closing of lips, but in the opening of the heart. It is saying, God, even if my words stumble, let them carry your light. It is understanding that silence is sometimes comfort for the self, but never healing for the world. God's truth was never meant to stay confined within a single soul. It was meant to move, to breathe, to travel through voices that dare to speak when silence is easier. Humility is not in thinking you are too small to be used. It is in believing that even your smallness can be holy when surrendered. The false humility that silences the spirit is born from pride, not meekness. It says, "My fear matters more than His command." But obedience whispers, "Even if I tremble, I will speak." The difference between humility and disobedience lies not in quietness, but in intent. One listens for God's timing, the other ignores His voice altogether. There will be times when the silence feels safe and the call to speak feels costly, but obedience always carries a cost, and silence carries a greater one. When you hold back truth, The weight of it does not vanish, it turns inward, pressing against your spirit until it becomes heavy with unrest. The peace you thought silence would bring begins to erode. The soul was not designed to hoard revelation, it was designed to release it. The voice that refuses to obey loses its sensitivity over time. The more you ignore the prompting, the quieter it becomes, until one day you cannot distinguish divine silence from spiritual deafness. That is the danger of disobedient quiet. It numbs the heart. But when you speak, when you obey even in trembling, something in you awakens. The fire grows stronger, the spirit becomes attuned, and heaven recognizes another vessel willing to carry its sound. Silence can seem noble, but obedience is sacred. When you open your mouth in faith, heaven amplifies your words beyond human strength. When you open your mouth in faith, heaven amplifies your words beyond human strength, and what seems like a simple act of obedience becomes a divine partnership between earth and eternity. The power of faith-filled speech is not in its volume, but in its alignment with divine will. When the heart believes and the mouth declares, creation listens. Faith transforms words into vessels of power, and heaven breathes life into them. What begins as a trembling whisper in the natural becomes thunder in the unseen. God has always worked through human cooperation, and your voice is one of His chosen instruments. When you speak with faith, you do not speak alone. You speak with the authority of the one who called all things into being. Your words become more than sound. They become the echo of heaven, resounding through places where hope has been silent too long. Faith does not need proof before it speaks. It declares before it sees, trusting that the unseen will manifest through obedience. There is a mystery in the way God magnifies the words of those who trust Him. He does not wait for your confidence. He moves through your surrender. When you open your mouth believing that His promise is true, even if your circumstances contradict it, heaven begins to move in alignment with your declaration. Mountains shift, hearts soften, doors open, not because your words have power of their own, but because they carry the breath of the Almighty. Faith is not the denial of difficulty, it is the announcement of divine authority. When you speak what God has promised, you give permission for the unseen to shape the seen. Heaven listens to faith and answers it with power. Your voice becomes an instrument through which miracles find their sound. The words of faith carry energy that cannot be measured by human reason. They create ripples that move through spiritual atmospheres, breaking barriers that logic cannot penetrate. When you speak healing, the vibration of those words begins to align with heaven's truth. When you declare peace, you invite the spirit of peace to reign where chaos once ruled. It is not your eloquence that moves heaven. It is your belief that God's word is still alive. The difference between an empty phrase and a living declaration lies in faith. One dies as soon as it is spoken. The other travels like lightning into the unseen realm and returns with evidence. When you open your mouth in faith, you step into the same rhythm that formed creation. The rhythm of divine command meeting human trust. There is a holy courage in speaking what has not yet appeared. Faith teaches you to call things that are not as though they were. When God sees that kind of faith, He multiplies its impact. The words may leave your lips in simplicity, but they return with supernatural weight. Heaven amplifies not the confident, but the obedient. Even a broken voice can become a trumpet of power when it carries belief. You may think your voice is small, but heaven does not measure strength in decibels. It measures it in faith. A whisper of belief outweighs a shout of doubt. God listens for the heart behind the sound. When your heart and voice align with His truth, He breathes on your words, and they begin to move with a force that human effort could never achieve. Faith transforms ordinary speech into prophetic sound. Every declaration made in faith carries an unseen multiplication. The moment you speak, heaven stretches your words across distances you cannot travel. The encouragement you give in one place might awaken hope in another heart far away. God's word never returns void, and when it passes through your lips, it carries His same promise. The amplification is divine, not mechanical. You may not see the full outcome of what you speak, but the impact continues beyond your sight. Words born of faith travel farther than sound waves. They travel through time, through spirit, through the hearts of those who need them most. Heaven takes your offering of faith and magnifies it until it becomes a force of transformation in the world. To open your mouth in faith is to surrender to the creative partnership of heaven and earth. It is to recognize that your words are not your own once they are spoken in obedience. They are infused with the same breath that once said, "Let there be light." That same divine energy still answers when it hears faith. There is no weakness in your voice when it carries belief. Heaven does not need your perfection. It needs your participation. Every miracle begins with someone who dared to speak when silence seemed easier. The woman with the issue of blood spoke within herself before she was healed. The centurion declared that Jesus only needed to speak the word. The blind cried out until the crowd tried to silence them, and heaven responded to their faith. Their words did not carry power because they were loud. They carried power because they were aligned with belief. Faith-filled words also reshape the speaker. When you speak in faith, you strengthen your own soul. Your voice becomes a reminder to your heart that God is still faithful. Every declaration of hope plants new confidence within you. The act of speaking activates the very faith you are expressing. Heaven amplifies your words outwardly, but something shifts inwardly too. The soul grows in courage, the mind becomes renewed, and the heart learns to trust more deeply. Speaking in faith is not only for others, it is for you. It silences the lies that whisper doubt. It reminds your spirit that you are in partnership with divine authority. The more you speak truth aloud, the more your heart learns to live within it. Heaven responds not only by amplifying your voice, but by transforming your inner world to match what you have declared. There is no boundary to how far faith-filled words can reach. What you speak in one moment can alter the destiny of another in ways unseen. The simple phrase of encouragement you share, the prayer whispered in solitude, the declaration spoken over your own struggle, all become tools in the hands of heaven. The power is not in repetition, but in revelation. When you know who is backing your words, you no longer doubt their worth. Faith gives sound to what heaven intends to do, and heaven gives strength to what faith dares to say. The partnership is sacred, and it never fails to yield fruit in time. When you open your mouth in faith, you become part of God's continuing story of redemption, His ongoing act of creation that never ceased after Genesis. You become a living echo of His authority, a voice through which eternity touches time. There will be moments when you will not feel the power of your words immediately. You may speak healing and still see sickness, speak peace and still feel storms, but faith is not measured by instant results. It is measured by obedience. Heaven does not amplify your impatience, it amplifies your trust. The results belong to God, the speaking belongs to you. Every word spoken in faith sets something in motion, whether you see it or not. The invisible always moves before the visible aligns. The command to open your mouth in faith is not a suggestion. It is an invitation to participate in divine order. When you obey, heaven resonates with your sound. What was once small becomes mighty. What was once human becomes holy. You are not the source of the power. You are the vessel through which it flows. Heaven takes your surrendered voice and turns it into a river of impact that no force on earth can contain.